back to Forensic Friday, everyone. Thank you for joining me today. As you know, today is all about animal forensics and wildlife crime. And today I have a special, fantastic guest with me here to tell you a little bit more about this. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Thanks, Heather. Hi, everyone. My name's Dr. Samantha Pickles. I am a senior lecturer in forensic science with the University of Bedfordshire, and I'm also an animal forensics consultant with Forensic Access Limited.
Would you like to tell us a little bit more about that, Samantha, please?
Of course. So my work as an academic obviously involves a combination of teaching students, training professionals, conducting research and undertaking legal casework. So overall, I suppose you could say my work involves raising awareness of animal forensics, particularly the different types of evidential opportunities that animals can bring to an investigation, and perhaps why we should be considering them just a little bit more, even in human-centric cases.
Would you mind just explaining a little bit what animal forensics actually is?
Yes, of course. Well, animal forensics is a very, very broad topic. It's as broad as its human counterpart, if not more so, because of course we're not just dealing with one species anymore. Animal forensics really will encompass all the things that you might imagine it to, such as wildlife crime, crimes against or involving other animals, and that may include livestock and domestic pets, and also the utilisation of animal-derived evidence in legal investigations. And obviously this can take many, many forms. And whilst it's not necessary to know all the different laws and regulations pertaining to what defines an animal crime, it's important to know that they do exist, and also that various authorities and agencies are responsible for investigating those crimes and determining whether such offences have occurred. It's also important to realise that these crimes relate to any action but also an omission, so that's not doing something. And any acts or omissions which contravene the legislation and regulations protecting our animals, the wildlife, and of course, not forgetting plants. So a crime can be committed following direct actions towards a protected species, or even, as I've mentioned, not doing something which could cause harm or risk to those species.
Thank you, Samantha. That sounds very interesting indeed. And again, I agree that animal forensics is just as important as human forensics overall. You mentioned briefly a little bit about wildlife crime. Would you like to just talk a little bit about that and how that differentiates from animal crime altogether?
Yes, of course. I'll try to keep this brief, but of course, wildlife crime is one of the largest areas, and perhaps probably more well known. If we're focusing on animals such as those that we are today, some helpful legislation is the Wildlife and Countryside Act 1981, and what that does is it tells us what an offence is, and that includes deliberately taking, capturing, injuring, or killing a protected species, intentionally or recklessly disturbing or obstructing access to that animal's home, so for example where it rests or breeds, even if there's not an animal present there at the time. And also to even possess, advertise, sell or exchange a protected species, whether alive, dead, or even the component parts of it. And whilst there are other legislations that protect certain species and habitats, as I've mentioned, many of us just really aren't aware of the extent of the law which protects our wildlife, both the plants and the animals. One of my favourite examples is that many people aren't aware that all wild birds, so any of your pigeons, your sparrows, not just those which are endangered or exotic, all wild birds, their nests and their eggs are protected by law. Now, of course, there are some exemptions. These generally require a special licence or certain activities can only be permitted around specific seasons. But I think that's a really great point for people just to take home. I don't know how much you or your audiences might be familiar with the wildlife crime policing priorities. Would you like me to discuss those a little bit more?
Yes, that would be really interesting. Thank you.
So it's important to note that wildlife crime is a policing priority, and when we go on to talk perhaps about domestic pets or animal welfare, that tends to be overseen, the investigations, by SPCAs such as the RSPCA or the Scottish SPCA. But for the policing, they have 6 current wildlife priorities. So these are the ones that are considered of special interest. Now, these will involve particularly raptors or specific birds of prey. So the persecution of birds of prey, the persecution of bats, the persecution of badgers, the poaching or coursing of deer and hare, and also the poaching of fish. And also other matters that include, for example, freshwater pearl mussels, which have been overly harvested to try to find the pearls that are inside, and actually they're quite rare to even find them. And there's also the local and international trade of endangered plants and animals that's also regulated. And for this, we have an international agreement between the governments, which is known as CITES, and that also relates to conservation issues. So it's not just outright banning the trade of certain species of animals and plants, it's also ensuring that that's sustainable. So certain species will be permitted for trade and some just not at all.
Thank you, Samantha, for just clarifying what wildlife crime is and also what animal forensics is and the difference between these and how vast these categories span. Would you mind just talking a little bit about things that aren't classed as wildlife crime?
Yes, so I think that's a really important point to raise, and one of my favourite examples, or one of the questions I often get asked, is what happens if someone hits a wild animal with a vehicle as part of a traffic incident. Now, this isn't considered a crime unless it's done deliberately, of course, and in which case there's a number of potential offences listed there. If an animal is involved in a traffic incident, particularly if it's a wild animal, then it should be reported to the police. Now, it's also important to note that that rule, if you like, extends to dogs, horses, cows, pigs, goats, sheep, donkeys and mules, etc. And if possible, the animal should ideally be taken to a vet immediately, where possible, as I mentioned, and of course, if it's safe. Now, we've also mentioned that under the Wildlife and Countryside Act, it's an offence to have an animal in your possession. Of course, if it's an injured animal that you're taking to seek veterinary treatment, that would be different, of course. And of course, with some animals, it may not be safe to try to put, for example, an injured badger in your car. But if the animal is severely injured or dead or dying, then it really should be moved to the side of the road, and both the police and the local council should be notified. I did mention about other crimes being investigated by other agencies. I've mentioned that with the RSPCA and the Scottish SPCA, they would be looking at incidents relating to the welfare of livestock and domestic pets. So technically these aren't wildlife crimes, but there can also be overlap between domestic animals and wildlife crime. For example, the use of dogs in badger baiting or hare or deer coursing.
But thank you, Samantha. Thank you for clarifying what isn't classed as a crime. As we know, sometimes accidents do happen on the road, but it's still important to know what legislation and what rules we should do if we do find an injured animal or if we are sadly involved with an accident. Would you mind just talking a little bit about the purpose of animal forensics and why that's important?
Absolutely. So one of the things that I always like to start off with when thinking about forensic science is just defining what forensics actually means. Now, it's taken from the Latin term for forum, which for our purposes is an open public forum, that is our courts, our legal system. So animal forensics in its most basic form would mean animals used in courts of law. Now, of course, animals cannot appear as witnesses themselves, and more importantly, they can't report the crimes committed against them or others. So these offences have to be recognised by other people and subsequently investigated. So we can start to think about the interpretation of animal evidence. And if we were looking at an allegation of deliberate or accidental hitting of an animal with a car, you might then start to think about blood and hair and damage, for example. So whilst we might think about animal-derived evidence, it can also be the animal itself as a whole, whether alive or dead, that we might need to think about. And what I really like to consider when it comes to animal forensics is the role of the animal itself. Now, it can be a victim, it can be witness to another crime, it can be an aggressor, or even a weapon. So you want to start to think about the animal in terms of the roles that it represents, the potential evidence that it could give us, and whether the information that provides could either support or refute an incident or an allegation. As I've mentioned, the case application is really vast. There are crimes against local and international wildlife, the trade and conservation matters, livestock, working animals, food, agricultural processes, and right down to the pets in our homes. Now, they won't always require or have requests for forensic evidence, but bearing in mind what forensics actually means, even the examination of an animal by a veterinary professional, for example, can represent a form of animal evidence. So really, traditionally, forensic evidence is used to confirm or refute associations or links between people, places, items, and of course, animals, often to determine whether certain actions or events, or to test the likelihood of particular scenarios occurring or not. Now, the findings of any forensic examination or analysis may be used to support a prosecution, so that is to determine whether the matter should go to court at all, or in the defence, that is if someone is in disagreement with the charges made or the offences which have been alleged. As with all forms of forensic evidence, animal forensics is not concerned with apportioning or alleviating blame, but using robust scientific approaches to assist the court in determining the facts of the matter, and then they will deal with any appropriate sentencing should they be required.
Thank you, Samantha. Now, we've spoke a lot about animals in general, but are there any kind of specific animals that are more common in animal crime? And if there are, why do you think this is? Is there any reason for this?
Well, obviously those animals that fall under the policing priorities will be given an extensive amount of attention and criminal investigation. But it's also important to think beyond wildlife crime as well. That the types of crimes that are associated with animals, as I've mentioned, can vary. But it's also important to note that they are rarely isolated, and there's often links to animal welfare offences or other human crimes. So some of the current issues that we see at the moment in the UK would include puppy farming and even smuggling puppies into the country from overseas, which aren't always in the best of health. And this tends to involve fraudulent breeding, overbreeding, and sales. And it actually can be very distressing, not just for the animals, but also the recipient of someone that has paid an awful lot of money for this beautiful puppy, only to find that it's severely ill and could in fact die. And we form such wonderful associations with pets. You can imagine how distressing that is. Another example would be badger baiting or fighting, which often, as I've mentioned, might use dogs or foxes or other animals. Now, that tends to also involve illegal gambling and associated with other quite serious human offences. And fighting involving dogs has been illegal for over 200 years now, so to consider that it's still a problem in today's world really tells you something about the criminal links and the worlds there. Now, both of these examples include not only very poor conditions for the animals involved, but often horrific acts of cruelty. And that's why it's so important that anyone that's involved in any legal investigation to be mindful of the presence of an animal or even the absence of an animal, and to consider the roles that they may play, as I've mentioned earlier, and also any potential evidential opportunities that they may hold. And this is especially true with animals that have received deliberate injuries, and we need to think about that in the context of our pets, for example.
With animal forensics being around and wildlife crime and the growing impact that forensics can have in helping this, has there been an increased awareness of this knowledge amongst vets?
Yes, I think so. It's quite an interesting topic, that one for me. Really, I've got some sort of some personal and professional opinions on that one, because vets are absolutely instrumental in all cases involving animals, and of course they're absolutely exceptional in the roles that they do with caring for and treating for animals. And veterinary medicine has been used in courts for quite some time, but what we need to see is this sort of more burgeoning veterinary forensics that is becoming more prevalent in these investigations. So ill or injured animals can undergo clinical examinations. Dead animals, even ones that have been purposefully euthanized by the vets, could be subject to a post-mortem examination in the same way that humans can. Now, obviously, veterinary staff need to recognise other forensic evidence beyond the animal itself. And that's where sometimes the problems can occur, because the recognition of non-accidental injury or the recovery of forensic material are topics that aren't particularly well covered in the veterinary curriculum or in professional practice training. Now, to me, this is particularly surprising as there's legislation which requires opinions that only vets themselves can provide. For example, identifying and communicating issues regarding suffering, which is at the heart of Animal Welfare Act, so the Animal Welfare Act 2006 here in England and Wales, and the corresponding acts in Scotland and Northern Ireland. So I think that's putting a lot of pressure and weight on an already overstretched community to then have to understand their roles and responsibilities in the legal context, perhaps without any particular training or support to enable them to do that.
So thank you, Samantha. Would you mind just telling us a little bit more about the training programmes?
Yes, so as I've mentioned, veterinary forensics has occurred in the court processes, and modern universities are starting to have more of this type of content in their courses. But to support the professional practices or the new students that are coming through the system, at Forensic Access, we've developed an online course called The Forensic Process. And this is specifically aimed at veterinary staff to assist them in recognising not only non-accidental or these deliberate injuries, but to also support them during casework. And that's whether they're involved in wildlife crime, animal cruelty, welfare cases, or if they just have an interest and they're looking for something new in their CPD requirements. Now, we've developed versions in the UK here, and we've done that in collaboration with Dr. David Martin, who is a veterinary surgeon with the Brownlow Vet Group. And we've also created versions in America with forensic veterinarian Dr. Melinda Merck. And we're really proud of these courses, not only because of the purpose that they fulfill, but they actually represent the first time traditional forensic standards, such as the ones that myself and other traditional forensic scientists adhere to, have actually been cascaded to the veterinary community and starting to pave the way for new standards and regulations going forward.
Those courses do actually sound really interesting, even as someone who is more knowledgeable on the forensic side rather than the veterinary side of processes. And I think if more vets are able to take these courses and become more knowledgeable, even if, say, it's not every vet that's in a practice, maybe just one or two, I think it will really help with the advances in the animal crime cases and wildlife crime also. So are there any kind of crossovers between the world of animal forensics and wildlife crime with the other kind of disciplines that fall under the whole forensic science bracket?
Yes, absolutely. Generally speaking, if a test or discipline exists in the human realm, then it can probably be applied to the animal world as well. And there's even some additional veterinary clinical tests that are available in the animal world that we don't have in the human world. So, for example, at Forensic Access and with some of the other forensic providers, expertise in forensic biology, ballistics, firearms, toxicology, all of the usual forensic disciplines that you've probably been talking about in these sessions can, of course, be applied to animal cases. My own subject specialism actually is entomology, and that's the utilisation of fly larvae or maggots to determine a period of infestation. Now, it's a great crossover for me because I will apply those techniques for both humans and animals, whether they are dead or alive. Now, it's not the most delicate of subjects. It's not for the faint-hearted. Would you like me to tell you any more about it?
Please, Samantha, I'd love for you to tell us just a little bit more about forensic entomology. We've spoken a bit previously on Forensic Fridays about forensic entomology and its application to humans, but I'd love to know just a little bit more about how it's applied to animals.
Obviously, I find insects fascinating, and it's their behaviours and the information that they can tell us in these particularly distressing circumstances that sort of elevates it beyond where the sort of the distressing elements, if you like. As you know, after death, a human body or an animal carcass can become a feeding and breeding ground for certain types of flies. Now, those flies are usually the blowflies, which are the metallic green or blue, so the blue bottles or green bottle flies that we might be familiar seeing in our gardens or around waste, and they obviously can enter our homes quite readily. Now, an animal or a human which has been injured or neglected can also be attractive to those flies, and the female will seek a host in which to lay their eggs. So the flies are attracted to various sources of decomposing organic matter. So open festering wounds, fur, fleece, or clothes or bedding which has been heavily soiled with urine, blood, fecal matter, for example, can potentially attract flies to begin laying their eggs. And those eggs will hatch into maggots, which can then grow essentially on the decomposing organic material and also the body of the host. Now, whilst the host is still alive, this type of infestation is known as meiosis, occurs when a person cannot look after themselves. We see that with the vulnerable, such as the elderly or the young, or if their carers aren't providing an adequate level of support or hygiene. And also we see this with animals. Of course, they cannot care for themselves. So in the wild, it may be an animal that's become injured, that is unable to care for itself and hasn't been picked up for veterinary treatment. Or it can be an animal that has been abused or neglected and that infestation has occurred. Now, the value of entomology, as you'll know, is that it can be used to create a timeline. So that could be determining how long a person or an animal has been dead, or how long that infestation has been occurring for. And that can be really important in animal cases to help the veterinary surgeon come to a decision regarding the determination of suffering and how long it's been occurring for. Or even other timing matters, such as how long veterinary treatment hasn't been sought for, or particularly with animals that have been caged or trapped that may have become injured or in poor conditions. So it's a way of exploiting the behaviour of another animal, insects, on humans or animals. So that's one of my favourite examples of crossover of forensic disciplines.
Thank you very much, Samantha. So earlier, Samantha, you mentioned a little bit about how normally majority of animal crimes are of the cause of a human. Would you like just to talk a little bit more about the link between animal and human offences?
Yes, of course. So we mentioned earlier the example of badger baiting, dog fighting, and even puppy breeding. And we can quite clearly see that there are other criminal offences in the human world that are occurring here. And as I mentioned before, aside from the wild animals, crimes are also committed against these domestic pets, sometimes concurrently. So the type of crimes that we see spanning both human and animals can vary in terms of what has occurred and why, but an area that is gaining more attention and globally is the link between animal and human crimes, in particular the interrelationships between animal abuse, domestic abuse, elder maltreatment and child abuse, for example. So these links that are occurring concurrently and why animals are so important in that. Now, as you've mentioned, all animal cruelty has to occur at the hands of a human perpetrator. And the progression of animal cruelty leading to human violence is quite regularly cited in the media at the moment regarding infamous serial killers in our television shows, films and documentaries. But as I've mentioned, we must also be aware that animal abuse and human abuse is occurring concurrently at the same time. And this is particularly important in the context of domestic violence, domestic abuse, as I've mentioned. So if we consider that research has shown that at least half of all domestic abuse cases involve threats or acts of violence towards pets too. Now, I've mentioned this wonderful human and animal bond that we have. You know, pets are considered extensions of our family. We buy them presents, we buy them toys. They often sleep in our beds, for example. We take great care. They are essentially extensions of the family. And that beautiful bond that we have, unfortunately, can be so easily exploited. And this is why it's essential that the veterinary community recognise non-accidental injuries. So be vigilant regarding a scenario that's been given that perhaps doesn't quite fit. It's not always easy to recognise non-accidental injuries. In fact, it's very similar to going back 20 or 30 years when the medical community had to be educated in recognising non-accidental injury in child abuse, and where we've got to that today. So it's a very similar situation. Now, that context of domestic violence, abuse, elder maltreatment and child abuse is summed up in a quote by the American Humane Association, and they state that when animals are abused, people are at risk. And when people are abused, animals are at risk. Now, that's not just for the domestic setting. It's not too stretch your imagination to consider that somebody involved in violent badger baiting and dog fighting acts, as I mentioned, could be involved in illegal gambling, aggressive or violent behaviour, the possession of weapons or drugs, the sharing of indecent or illegal material. So this whole concept of the link between animals and humans, both in terms of our behaviour, but also how we mistreat them, is something that is of a global concern. And by considering our relationships and our behaviours towards animals, we could perhaps add a new dimension to investigations involving animals, as I said, even in these human-centric cases.
Thank you, Samantha. I do find that quite fascinating because, as you said, we do, as a nation, as a world, essentially, we love animals and we love that connection that we can make with them. It's right what you say, the link between if a person can be like abusive to another human being, there's that link that they could also be abusive to animals, and vice versa. If they're abusive to animals, they could also be abusive to humans. So I think that is something that is important and does need to be taken into consideration when thinking about these things as a whole, rather than just on a focus on one individual crime itself.
Absolutely. I mean, what we can really take away is that animal abuse or animal crimes very rarely occur in isolation. There is a proclivity towards reoffending, escalation in severity, and whilst this can sometimes be considered as a form of sort of practicing those skills, getting more severe or more risky in terms of the crimes that they're committing, and this is the trajectory that we often look at in hindsight with, as I've mentioned, some of our most prolific serial killers. And I'd really like to think that maybe there's a way that we can utilise that in a preventative method. We can't go so far as to say that everyone that hurts an animal will go on to be a serial killer. We can't necessarily say that it is predictive of a certain set of behaviours. But for example, if a child or a young adult is displaying repeated and severe incidents of animal cruelty, it's probably reflecting a problem somewhere else in their lives. And then we can have some form of intervention. And there's a number of programmes that the Scottish SPCA and the RSPCA, for example, are leading. And I think they're really excellent movements going forward.
Thank you. Yeah, I agree. I think that is something that does need to be focused on and have more kind of input and more exploration, essentially, as this is, again, as you said, something that could be a preventative method rather than looking back in hindsight and going, oh, there's like the links. So yeah, thank you very much. So we've spoke a lot overall, a little bit about yourself at the beginning. We've spoke about animal forensics and wildlife crime. Would you like just to tell me a little bit how you got into this field yourself and how you've gone about your journey in your life?
Yes, of course. Well, it may come as no great surprise to know that I was a student of forensic science myself. I understand, obviously, you've got some great courses at Wolverhampton, just as we have here at Bedfordshire. I'll admit I didn't start with animal forensics. I mentioned earlier that it's not something that we see in the veterinary curriculum. Well, it's not something we see greatly in the human curriculum or even in professional practice. It was a good sort of 15 years into my career before I was made aware of the link, and you have this sort of light bulb moment, because of course I'd worked on cases that had involved animals, particularly with entomology, but had never really made those associations. So yes, I started out as an undergraduate student in forensic science, and again, this is absolutely true. My favourite unit was plants and animals in crime, but again, I didn't know that's where I would end up. I specialised in entomology very early on. I found it fascinating, even though I thought it's actually, not the most pleasant. But if I utilise this as a focus point for my research, I don't suppose many of my fellow students are doing it. So if I do a great piece of work or project on it, this will get noticed. And that sort of backfired, because I ended up essentially falling in love with forensic entomology. And that's the route that I specialised in. And I was very fortunate to undertake research with the Natural History Museum and the entomology department there, and led on to a job almost immediately following graduation. So it's a mixture of hard work and good luck and great timing. And then I trained as a forensic biologist specialising in entomology, and started to go to crime scenes and write statements for court. And as I said, started to see more cases of meiosis, so that's the living host infestation in humans, also seeing those in animals. Fast forward a few years to my time with Forensic Access, and I was asked to oversee the forensic process CPD e-learning programs that we created. And actually entomology is what opened the door really for me to talk with veterinary professionals, because actually vets are more happy to talk about maggots and fleas and ticks than most humans are. So that became a really great way to open that dialogue. And then I just became absolutely fascinated with the role of vets and vet nurses and their support staff, and how instrumental they are to these investigations, hence working to create these training programs for them. And I'm just passionate about forensic science and my area, so I want to communicate what I think are important issues, to pass on the training I've been so fortunate to have to other students, and hopefully see the next wave of forensic scientists as they join this exciting field.
Thank you very much, Samantha. That does sound like an interesting and fantastic journey that you've had. And I agree with loads of points that you said there. It's all about when you're doing like your undergraduate degree, or sometimes even your master's, it's when you find that one specific area that sings out to you essentially, and that's when you find your passion. I think I agree with you in my sense of, it wasn't until I was doing my third year dissertation where I fell in love with my topic area, and that's what I've decided to pursue. So thank you very much.
No, thank you, and I wish you and of course any other students that might be watching this all the best in their studies, particularly at this time of year. And you know, we're always happy to supply additional information to anyone that might be following these sessions. So always happy to help.
Thank you, Samantha.
Thank you, and thank you for the invite.